To Sonia Ahmad, PhD candidate in city and regional planning here at Cornell, to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce Junaid Shaikh, who's the Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His recent book, Caste, Bombay, City Making and the Politics of the Poor, was published by the University of Washington Press in the United States and by Orient Black Swan in India. He's a visiting research fellow at the Shelby Davis Center at Princeton University this semester. His new work is on the life and times of Gangadhar Adhikari, a Bombay Marxist. He was the recipient of the Dean's Medal for the Social Sciences as a graduate student at the University of Washington. And before his reinvention as a historian, a fun fact is that he was a journalist in India.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Sonia, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming here. Before I begin my talk, I'll draw a lot from Caste, Bombay, the book, but I have also added some new work that I've been able to do over the past few months, and you'll see that too in the talk. It's a way of keeping me honest so that I keep doing some work on the new project. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Of course, revolution and slums, because I think I'm thinking of them as keywords, keywords to understand Bombay City, keywords that people have used to understand Bombay City. In the works of, in fact, one of your colleagues, Enzo Traverso, revolution can be used as an interpretive lever. You open it up to understand the city itself. So I'll focus on some of the actors who have used them. And provide a history of how revolution and slums, these categories were used and how they played out in practice. So the question that Caste Bombay, the central question that Caste Bombay explores is, what is the history of caste in Bombay City? Right? Caste, of course, the book, the main important, the thesis, the central thesis of the book is that capitalism in Bombay City, industrial capitalism, attaches itself to caste. And by that, I mean, by attaching and then leeching on caste, I mean that when Bombay merchants who had made money in the opium trade with China in the 19th century, in the first half, and then of course also in the second half of the 19th century, when they sort of diversified their portfolio, they ended up, some of them started industries. Now, in order to start industries, you need many things, and one of the things that you need is capital, of course. They were diversifying their portfolio, but they still needed money, and for that money, they raised money through their social networks, and that social networks really were caste and kinship networks. So in order to start an industry, industrial capitalism, relied on caste. Now, after starting an industry and you import machinery, then you recruit labor. You have to recruit labor, and you have to recruit lots of labor. You need many more people in the city coming to the factory gates so that you can push down the wages. Right? And these are laborers who are, most of them are minimally trained, and therefore can be interchanged one for the other, most of them. So for that too, for recruiting that labor, again, Bombay capitalists relied on caste, and it's not just in the textile industry, but also in the docks and other places where caste played an important role. And then once you have the labor in the city, of course, you need to discipline the labor. And again, the jobber or the muqaddam who had recruited labor through his caste and kinship connections played an important role in disciplining the labor force. And also, once you're in the city, you need somewhere to stay, somewhere to live. You need to reproduce the labor force. And so in this too, caste and kinship network played an important role. Of course, most laborers were single, they married, they left their families in the villages, etc. And a lot of the work of reproduction was also shared by the village. But in the city, living and staying and either in tenements or slums, that also they relied on caste and kinship network. And yet, caste, though it's so important, generally gets a short shrift, or at least people don't pay enough attention to caste in the city, because it's seen, for some reason, or over a period of time, it is seen as a rural phenomenon and not something to be studied in the city. M.N. Srinivas, the Indian sociologist, had once famously said that there is not enough material to study caste in a city. Right? So the argument that the book makes is people are not finding enough material because caste is hiding in plain sight in the city. And the two sites that the book explored are the built environment and language. And the chapters of the book substantiate that. These are the chapters of the book, and because I am a historian, and the chapters of the book go chronologically mostly. Starts in 1896, and if you see, it's ending in 1984. And in that, in these chapters, the question of housing, as I was describing just a little bit, with language, then the question of Marxism and how Marxism gets taken up and then translated, etc., which I'll draw a lot on today. Then once you're in the city, and there is, of course, the politics of urban planning, the city corporation, the regional state, then the centralized state. They all are invested in planning, and in that planning, slums, of course, play an important role as an eyesore that has to be removed, etc. So urban planning, and then these slums became the site for also the production of culture. So some of the people who grew up in the slums, many Dalits who grew up in the slums, who are also some of them were part of the Marxist movements and had grown up with the Marxist movement. Then ended up starting a field of Dalit literature, and then later on in the 1970s, the Dalit Panther movement. And so the last two chapters talk about Dalit literature in conjunction with urban planning and some of the historical changes that are taking place in Bombay. As I was saying, access to a job was dependent on caste in the city. And most Dalits in the city were in had low-paying jobs in the textile industry, or in the docks, or in hospitals, in the railways, in the sanitation department of the municipal corporation. For instance, in the docks, laborers who handled coal or were mostly Dalits, for instance. If you have to go and load the ship, some of that most of those laborers were Dalits. And then particularly then in textile industry, the low-paying jobs were also had staffed by Dalits. And that this low-paying jobs, this was something that Morris had pointed out in the 1950s and 1960s. He had spoken about the labor market in the city as, you need minimally trained labor that could be easily hired and then easily dismissed. Right? So if there is a need and you need to work hard for those 8 to 10 days, you need lots of laborers because there is some contract or some deadline. You need those laborers recruited immediately, and then you also can dismiss them. So they wanted this type of a labor force, which is a flexible labor force. A disposable labor force, also a low-paid labor force, also a mostly unskilled labor force. And it's in response to that, then some trade unions started emerging in the city from the 1880s onwards, right? But many of them were short-lived trade unions until the 1920s, when some of the communist unions and then a couple of other unions came up in the city. And this labor then, of course, lived in either chawls or tenements, or in slums, because many workers slightly higher in the caste ladder than Dalits did not want to stay with some of the Dalit workers. So they did not have access to tenements, particularly in the if you're going to private landlords, particularly that was the case. And in places like the Bombay Improvement Trust tenements, and then the later Bombay Development Department tenements. And this is an image from Bernard Hurst, 1925 image from Bernard Hurst, and you can see the BIT or the Bombay Improvement Trust tenements in the background. Sometimes particular buildings in those in these tenements were given to Dalits, and we have evidence of that. And my book has evidence of that. There were surveys done to ask caste, and then Dalits were given some 1 or 2 buildings in a complex of 20-25 buildings. They had 1 or 2 buildings where they lived. And many, of course, who either could not afford to live or were not allowed to live there, lived in then tenements like these, structures like these. This is from Bernard Hurst. So in this, as I've introduced the problem in this, of course, there is capital, and then there is caste, which is coming together and intersecting. So how do you then think of this social formation, and how do you then try to transform this social formation? One, of course, the word that comes up again and again in the 20th century is is of revolution. A revolution will be the way to transform this, of caste and low-paying jobs, etc. Right? And revolution was a term. It's the 20th century, of course. Revolution is on people's minds, not just because of the Russian Revolution and later on the Chinese Revolution, but there's also many people also trace some lineage back to the French Revolution too. So many people invoke the term revolution, not just political leaders and not just Marxists, but also Ambedkar uses the term revolution, etc. But also activists, also urban planners, for instance. Right? Of course, the meanings of what revolution meant was different. But revolution was a call to rapidly transform something, disrupt some practices, and that disruption of practices will then produce a rupture, which will then rapidly transform this social formation. Okay. So for Ambedkar, annihilation of caste, which he proposes in the 1930s, is of course a revolution. But he's using that term, and he's using the term revolution even before that. So for him, for instance, temple entry or rights to draw water from a public well, he also describes that as revolution in the 1920s. Right? So even rights for him, civic rights, was described by him as revolution. Marxists, of course, wanted a revolution in which the working class, and the vanguard of the working class would lead the revolution of the working class along with peasants, and then pave the way to socialism. And for urban planners, revolution, of course, meant a dramatic change in the social arrangement of the city, right? And in which they had things to say about the tenements and the chawls, in which many urban poor, including many Dalits, lived. And for the Dalit writers and the Dalit panthers in the 50s, 60s, 70s, revolution meant a negation of social and cultural hierarchies. Right? The writers wanted to create a field of literature called Dalit literature, which is a negation of dominant Marathi literature. So they saw themselves as distinct from Marathi literature in the 1960s and 70s, and wanted recognition for that, and gained recognition for that. These revolutions, of course, they're easy to invoke. The way they work out in practice is very different, and they often most revolutions will fail and do fail. Right? But they articulated something. They articulated that vision of this social, spatial, political, cultural transformation, which continues to capture the imagination of people. Which is why, even though revolutions of, let's say, of the 1920s, and particularly in the 1920s and 30s interwar period, even though those invocations of revolution failed, but still revolution as a keyword came up again in the 1950s. Rohit Day, who's a historian at Yale University, in his wonderful book, has said that the vision of a social revolution gets institutionalized in India's constitution, right? And I would say one of the reasons why it gets institutionalized in the constitution is because there are these visions of dramatic transformation, revolution that are they were there from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, which is why it gets institutionalized there in the 1950s in the constitution. And of course, then what happens to it, of course, is different stories. So Marxism, of course, I'll focus a lot on Marxist vision for a revolution, because that's also my interest in my second project, and it's keeps me working a little bit on my second project. So how revolution was imagined by Bombay Marxists in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and what was the practice of revolution, which is very different. Right? One of the things that is very important in this vision of a revolution that I point out, and I'll point out in this talk, and I also did a little bit in the book itself, was the category of the lumpen proletariat. The lumpen proletariat, in Marxian terms, they were for Marx, particularly in the 1840s, was they were not very sure about the lumpen proletariat. They were, in fact, thought that they could be mobilized easily to break strikes, etc. Vision that also seeped into the vision of, or the imagination of, Bombay Marxists, who also, for them, the lumpen proletariat was a source of anxiety and derision. Right? But this lumpen proletariat, the figure of the lumpen proletariat, gets picked up by Dalit writers. Right? And the Dalit writers, they humanize this figure of the lumpen proletariat. They talk about the social relationship of the lumpen proletariat in the city, particularly in the slums. The lumpen proletariat becomes a key figure in Dalit literature. Right? But you can see some of you can trace it from Marxism, the Marxist translations in Bombay, and then you can trace it all the way to Dalit literature in the 60s and 70s. Marxism, of course, in order to capture the imagination of the people, in order to appeal to the people in India in the 1920s and 30s, they had to address certain questions that people are experiencing. Right? And if you want a revolution, they could not leave the question of caste unaddressed. They have to say something about it, because this is a social hierarchy in which caste is an important feature of the social hierarchy. Right? And of course, by the 1920s, there is a strong anti-Brahmin movement which comes up in the second half of the 19th century itself. But there is also a strong Dalit movement that is emerging in the 1920s. And Bombay Marxists have to say something about this. And what they say, we'll see, is not sometimes very problematic, and we'll consider that. So in their view, of course, as I've been saying, that revolution was the way to transform, for the Marxists, a revolution was a way to transform this social formation. But the key question that gets posed by the anti-Brahmin leader, and particularly I'll focus, of course, on the Dalit leaders in the 1920s and 30s, is, can this class revolution also append caste relationship? Will that class revolution be a way to annihilate caste? And that's where a lot of the debate happens, and I'll focus on that in just a little bit. But in order to even think of something like revolution, etc., and Marxist notions of revolution, you need to have Marxist literature, right? Or you need to read certain things. This is, of course, the colonial times, where there not much. There is an apparatus for surveillance and for stopping literature from flowing in. That doesn't mean that literature did not. I mean, through various channels, pamphlets came into Bombay and in South Asia. But they trickled in. Many of these literatures trickled in. And we get a sense of what trickled in through some of the sources, the investigation, the CID sources, through the intelligence apparatus. They have compiled lists of things that they have procured from post offices or from ships, etc. Or seized from those. And these included writings from Germany, the United States, Britain. By the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet Union is not pushing things in, right? Soviet Union has still not, and according to Eric Hobsbawm, Soviet Union only gets involved in this production of Marxist texts much later, really in the 1940s and maybe really after Stalin in the 1950s. Right? So things that are coming into Bombay are really from Germany, the United Kingdom, United States, and some of these places. Right? And these are some of the texts that end up coming to India. There's M.N. Roy, of course, who was a very important figure in Indian Marxism. But there are things like T.J. Holmes's Socialism, Aims, Methods and Tactics, Daniel DeLoyne's pamphlet. And the other way, apart from post office, one other way, of course, an important way in which Marxism came to the city was, of course, through this merchant and landlord Ranchodas Lotwala, who also was the editor of this daily called Hindustan. And he, on his trips to Europe in the 1910s and the 1920s, had started collecting Marxist literature from Europe. And he had brought the Communist Manifesto. He had a copy of the Communist Manifesto and some other Marxist texts, pamphlets, Wage, Labor and Capital, etc. And it is in his library that one of the foremost Marxists from Bombay and one of the foremost Marxists of India, Shripad Amrit Dange, he read the Communist Manifesto in his library. Right? So this is how the texts are coming in. And some of the first publications of these pamphlets in English at the moment, they have not been translated yet into Marathi. In Bengali, the Communist Manifesto gets translated in 1926, but in Marathi only in 1931. So these English pamphlets are being published in Bombay, and it's in his press, that is Lotwala's press, that they are getting published. And he founded a trust for the propagation of socialism. Lotwala is an interesting character. He also was a supporter of the Aryan Samaj, also funded the Arya Samaj. And it seems like an apparent contradiction, but you know, for him, I guess there was no contradiction here. So rent from private property, ironically, helped propagate socialism in Bombay, particularly in the 1920s. And Dange was always most thankful to Lotwala for his help in propagating socialism. And it's a weekly that Dange started in Socialists. The weekly is called The Socialists. That Dange started first laying out some of his visions of what this socialism is, and as I will also say, how he addressed the question of caste in in this weekly. It's in this weekly that he cultivated a group of friends, scholars, young socialists, who became very key players in the formation of the Communist Party of India in 1925. It was originally founded in 1920 in Tashkent, but it was founded in India in 1925. Dange was not one of the founding members, because by then he was arrested. In 1924, he was arrested and was in jail for the Kanpur conspiracy case, as it's called. This, of course, this is a field in which, of course, there are these young intellectuals who are trying to read whatever Marxism that comes their way. Some of the places in which they're reading is Lotwala's library, of course. But that's not all. There are some really very fascinating figures, actually. And I hope someday we can talk a lot more about people like Karim, we find more evidence of people like Babu Karim, for instance, who studied until who was minimally educated. Eventually, after working in city hotels, he eventually finds work as a lascar on a ship And that takes him to different parts of the world and different ports in the city. And he attends meetings of the socialists in Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester. He collects communist literature in these places and he brings them to India. So the Lascars, of course, were also an important, a very important conduit for transmitting socialist literature into South Asia at this time. So, as I had introduced this point earlier, but I had not addressed is how would Marxism, how would they imagine disrupting these power relationships in Indian society, in which, of course, capitalists are important, and class is an important, the most important political category for Marxists. But you also have to say something about caste, because that's an important feature of social hierarchy. Right? In order to use some of these pamphlets to shed light on Indian society, it immediately raises the question of translation. Right? Marxism has to say something which can be used in the context of Bombay that I'm describing, of course. Right? And if you're translating, then there is the question of language. And language, because I mean, language not just in translating Marxist sociological categories, how use, value, etc., which we'll see in just a little bit, but also the terms that are used from the Indian languages to coin these conceptual categories. Right? And since caste, as I've been saying, is an important feature of the social hierarchy, how will this caste be appended? They needed to have a theory of caste. And their theory of caste went something like this, which is that now in these stages of production, which they borrow from Marx and Engels, of course, the feudalism, of course, is getting will be overcome by capitalism. Caste, of course, is a feudal remnant. So capitalism will desiccate caste, weaken caste affinities, and it's their work is then to get hold or aggregate these workers, assemble these workers in a class formation. And in this process, caste will become redundant, will be negated. Right? That's the theory of caste, and which you can see in many Marxists, including people like M.N. Roy, which he says that caste, after the introduction of modern industries, caste is not a living social factor. That also says caste will be overcome by modern industry, political democracy. But as I've been saying, and as we all know from our now experiences of, particularly if you think of Indian democracy, caste, in fact, becomes more robust and more insidious. Right? As if you remember, my argument is that capital is leeching on caste, and that's making it more robust, more insidious. So Dange attempted the task took on this task of explaining caste from the vantage point of its end, which is end is, of course, socialism, and then the commune, where the state will disappear. You capture the state, and then eventually the state will disappear. So Dange is trying to describe caste from this vantage point of its end. What he does is he posits a commune in Indian antiquity, right? And he calls it an Aryan commune. And in order to his evidence for this Aryan commune, of course, is a lot of mythology and some historical works from intellectuals in the region, including people like Tilak, his hero, which we'll talk about, but people like Rajwade, etc. These are some of his heroes. So he posits a commune. Something happens to this paradise in which then the commune will disappear. But here is how he is deriving a lot from people like Tilak, who have, as I've said, is his hero. The periodization of this commune is also very interesting. He registers the Aryan presence in India in Tilak did it in 4500 BCE. Dange, in fact, is pushing it back when this is what Tilak wanted, that he wanted to push it back further still. And the commune, the Aryan presence in India, and then the commune dating back to as early as 6000 BCE, between 4000 and 6000 BCE. If you look at ancient India historians, they, particularly people like Romila Thapar, they register Aryan presence in India somewhere around 1500 BCE. Just to compare what Dange is doing and what Indian historians are, what seems to be the consensus among many Indian historians of Indian antiquity. So in this commune, this wonderful Aryan commune, over a period of time, it devolves, where a division of labor develops, and a lot of the way in which people describe caste was division of labor. And then that division of labor gets solidifies into caste. And its solution, of course, again, like Roy and like R.P. Dutt, the solution is modernity, capitalism, and then socialism will end caste. And for this, as I'm saying, he derives a lot from mythology. So even something like the Bhagavad Gita, he, in his own way, he's saying he's doing an economically deterministic reading. He's happy to claim that of the Gita, and the Gita is providing evidence for this division of labor, and for his the way his economic determinism too. Right? So when the Gita records the testimony of Lord Krishna that he had created the 4 divisions on the basis of guna and karma, he means nothing else than the divisions were an economic necessity of production. Right? So this is the evidence that he's providing for how then caste comes into being after this, after the Aryan commune. This, of course, Aryan commune, of course, is a category which is much disputed, much debated in many parts of India, particularly in Western India from the 19th century onwards, from the second half of the 19th century onwards. There are huge debates in Western India. There is, of course, a strong anti-Brahmin movement that comes up, and Rosalind O'Hanlon and many other scholars, Susan Bailey and all, have written wonderfully about those. In that vision, the Aryans are seen as people who then impose caste after capturing, usurping property, etc. in India. They then impose their caste, impose their religion, and compose books justifying caste. That's the vision of caste in the anti-Brahmin intellectuals of the 19th, and then also the Dalit movement of the 20th century. Right? Dange, of course, is completely ignoring. For him, there is an Aryan commune which is paradisical. For the anti-Brahmin intellectuals and Dalit leaders, this is in fact the moment in which caste comes up and is imposed. Right? So Ambedkar, as early as the 1970s and 17 in Caste in India, in his seminar paper, which was then later published in Indian Antiquity, he says that this argument about the division of labor underestimates the power of the Brahmin caste in perpetuating the caste system, in creating the caste system, and then perpetuating the caste system. Right? And because it's the Brahmin caste, then it gets emulated by the non-Brahmin caste, and that's how caste becomes more insidious and robust. Dange, as I'm saying, because the theory that Dange and many Bombay Marxists believe in is that caste is about to be redundant. If it's not redundant at all, I mean, it's already been desiccated by capitalism. So if that is the case, then any demands in the name of caste or any assertions of caste identity by anti-Brahmin or Dalit intellectuals is seen angrily, or is met with is critiqued fervently by Dange and by some of the Marxists. And you see that evidence very early on in the socialists in 1922, 1923 itself. In one of the editorials that Dange has written, it's called Brahmin and Non-Brahmin War. He critiques the non-Brahmin movement for being unpatriotic, because they, according to him, they are not averse to working with the colonial government, since they only want a share in the spoils of the colonial government, and therefore they are petit bourgeois. And for the lack of acceptance of the comradeship of class. Right? So this is the anti-Brahmin movement. And he also then later on, of course, critiques the Ambedkarite movement too in the 1930s. Right? So according to him, it's the anti-Brahmin movement who are bringing up caste again and again. And they are putting a spanner in the works of class solidarity. Class is, for him, the important political category. And there are, of course, many anti-Brahmin leaders who are part of the communist movement too. People like Arjun Alve and Caste, who were arrested for being communist and jailed. And in jail, where even Dange and other leaders are, they are criticizing each other for according to Marxists, for their strong anti-Brahmin feelings that they are propagating among workers. Right? And Alve and Caste are calling their colleagues communist Brahmins. So this, and when Ambedkar, when Ambedkar gets separate electorates after the third roundtable conference in 1931, that is called artificial and reactionary by some of the Bombay Marxists. The colonial government support to Dalits, and for Ambedkar's eagerness to accept that award is called artificial and ultimately and reactionary by some of the Marxists. So this socialist revolution in practice, the way that it worked out, of course, I have things to say about, and we can maybe talk about it in the question and answer session. I have things to say about how caste worked in the trade union movement too, and how caste operated in practice. Very briefly, I would just say that in practice, according to Ambedkar, caste worked in the trade union movement in order to maintain the dominance of some of the upper caste workers, dominance of the higher paying jobs in the weaving departments. So even trade unions, Ambedkar had a critique of that, how they operated in practice. And Ambedkar, of course, and Ambedkar's followers, there is an anonymous article. So Ambedkar and Ambedkar's followers, of course, had reservations about communism and the future of communism in India, particularly on the question of caste. Right? In an anonymous article, Ambedkar says that communism could uproot the mammoth tree of Tsarism in Russia, but Brahminism will survive its onslaught. And as you can see, their heads are in Russia while the bodies live in India. Very evocative imagery. And when he says, the article goes on to say, it's an anonymous article, but it's a weekly that he has edited. The article goes on to say, when communists are produced in Dalit caste and backward caste, that's when maybe communism will become self-reflexive in India. Right? Of course, and now we have evidence of many Dalits embracing Marxism or being part of the communist movement in the 1920s and 1930s. None more so than R.B. More, who was recently translated. His memoirs were recently translated by Anupama Rao and Vandana Sonalkar. So it's available in English. But there are also figures like P. Palan or Lingam, who came from what is now modern-day Telangana and worked in the Bombay industries, went to Russia to work in the University of the Toilers of the East, came back to Bombay and was part of the Marxist movement. Palan or Lingam was also a Dalit. More, of course, propagated organized reading classes for his friends. In the Mahar Samaj, Mahar is a subcaste of Dalits. They were reading Marxist pamphlets. He invited intellectuals to come and talk about Marxism. There, S.V. Deshpande, for instance, had come to talk about Marxism. There's a wonderful social network of these places, and there are aspiring in the 1930s, aspiring Bollywood singers and songwriters who are part of this network of where they are reading Marx. Many of them are also Dalits. And More tries to forge a link and brings the question of caste, tries to come back to it again and again. He is part of the communist movement, remains part of the communist movement, but keeps bringing up the question of caste. And some of his colleagues, of course, critiqued him for it too. And some of this tension, he's hoping that the experience of being Dalit and poor and the category of working class, that apparent tension in that will get resolved too. The work of translation, since translation is important term and category that I've been using again and again. The work of translation itself and the publication was done by some of these intellectuals. And there were two publishing houses belonging to two different factions who do this, the Kamgar Vangmay Prasarak Mandal and the Marxist Vangmay Pracharak Mandal. Right? And some of these pamphlets get translated from 1931 onwards, 31, 32, 33. These pamphlets are produced then and are immediately banned by the colonial government, but they are circulating in the underground. A feature of this translation, which again raises the question of social hierarchy in India, is that the abstract categories are translated in Sanskrit or Sanskritized Marathi, while the embodied categories like the lumpen proletariat, for instance, get translated in the urban slang. Right? So abstract category is like mulya, value is mulya, or use value is upyukta vastu. These are some of the commodities, kriya vastu, production is utpadan. But categories like the lumpen proletariat or it gets translated into Mawali. Of course, there are different readings of Mawali too. Mawali, many colonial administrators, many scholars believe that Mawali is Mawali are people from the Mawal region of Western India, which may not be the only category. They are used as that. But Mawali, of course, is also an Arabic word. An Arabic word that describes non-Muslims in 8th, 9th, 10th century period of Muslim expansion. So so Mawali is also a term used for that, right? But Mawali generally in this context is used to mean people from the Mawal region. That is in Bombay, in the context of Bombay city. And people like and terms like when they are translating the term Negro from Negro slaves from wage labor and capital, they're translating it as Siddhi Gulam, which is again a group of people which are found in Western India of East African origin. In the Communist Manifesto, the lumpen proletariat are the unemployed, jobless criminals, right? And they are seen as an ally of the upper class who can use them for their ends in 1848, 49. But then Marx and Engels then try and appraise their understanding of the lumpen proletariat. They think that they potentially can be allies of the proletariat itself, right? But in Marx and Marx's works, this category largely disappears. I mean, he comes up again in the first volume of Capital as the reserve army of labor, but largely disappears. But in Bombay, it has a very long and interesting afterlife as the lumpen proletariat, right? Where for Marxists, of course, again, the Mawali is the strike breaker. and the problem of strike breakers is, of course, a persistent threat for them. But in Dalit literature, then the lumpen proletariat, the mawali, the criminal, the sex worker, vagabonds are taken up again, as I mentioned earlier, and are humanized in some of the writings of the Dalit writers. Right? For instance, somebody like Namdev Dhasal had, claims this category jubilantly, the category of the mawali. What I mean to say is, mawali becomes, as lumpen proletariat, becomes an important category in Bombay in the 20th century, either for Marxists as threat of strike breakers, who could then put a spanner in the works of the revolution, or for somebody like Namdev Dhasal, and for the Dalit Panthers as people who may play a very important, or who would play an important role in a revolution in the 1970s. This the question of cultural politics, since in Dalit literature, the term mawali, of course, as I was saying, and Dalit literature is important. But who are the icons of Dalit literature? Who are the icons of people like Dhasal and Bagul and Dangle? One of the icons, most important icons, is of course Annabhau Sate, who's the hero. And Annabhau Sate comes from a Matang caste, but is one of the founders of a cultural troupe, the Red Flag cultural troupe, affiliated with the Communist Party of India. And he's written copiously. Annabhau Sate is a fascinating figure too. Would hang around with many the film community of Bombay in the 1940s, 50s. Was a friend of Raj Kapoor too. And in his writing, which he in his Lok Natyas, which was a form of tamasha, but in order to escape the censor, they used the term Lok Natyas in the 1940s. This, in one of those Lok Natyas, in Silent Profession, you see this tension in Annabhau Sate's work too, where the slum dweller, the mawali, is seen as it's seen as somebody who has a lower status than workers, which is a very Marxist understanding of the lumpen proletariat and the slum proletariat. Right? And you can see this in Sate's writing, because in his understanding of Marxism, in his there is a progression of socioeconomic development that is is borrowed from primitive communism to capitalism, and then to socialism in the future. But in that, he maps types of habitation onto this progression. So in primitive communism, they lived in caves, and then hills, then to huts, then to plains, mud houses. And under capitalism, they should be living in tenements. But many of them are living in slums, and slums is the people living in slums are the lumpen proletariat, who have the lower status, right? So living in slums, he sees is a regression, and he says that slums, the capitalists see slums as a regression or as a blot on the city, and therefore they want to burn some of the slums in the 1940s, 50s. That's the point he's making. It's debatable, arguable. But the point that the reason I'm invoking Annabhau Sate, and I've spoken a lot about Annabhau Sate in the book too. The reason I'm doing it is because to trace a lineage from Annabhau Sate, and then some of the things that Dalit writers who end up starting Dalit literature as a separate field end up doing in the 1960s and 70s. Right? And many Dalit writers or intellectuals from the 1940s, 50s onwards are thinking of this field of literature called Dalit literature. They've been spending time. They want to create a field. Right? They want to create a separate field called Dalit literature. And Siddharth College, a college in Bombay, started by Ambedkar, and of course is an important site for it. The Siddharth College's magazine is where some of the early debates go on. But it's taken forward really and picked up by writers living in city slums who many of them have definitely not gone to college, like Bagul, like Dasal. They have not gone to college, right? So they are the ones who take it forward. But in that also there are intellectuals like M.N. Wankhede, a Dalit intellectual who on a scholarship comes to the US to first do a master's in Indiana and then a PhD in University of Florida, and he does a PhD on African American literature, and he takes that up and introduces some of that writing to some of these young writers in the 1960s and 70s, and wants them to emulate some of the African American literature. And he, very interestingly, also posits that social anthropology should be the model. Social anthropology would provide a way of capturing Dalit experiencing in literature and would help people engage with, or non-Dalits engage with Dalit lives, Dalit literature. And now that many Dalits were converting to Buddhism in Western India, in Bombay city, particularly the Mahars at this time, says social anthropology will also help them create new myths, because they are abandoning Hinduism. But if you translate social anthropology to literature, that road winds its way through the city slums, where the lumpen proletariat, the built form of the city, casteism, violence, prostitution, sex work, etc. These are some of the important themes in the short stories and poems in Dalit literature, and these are the themes that give it drama, tragedy, also titillation. But therefore, in Dalit literature, Mawali is not just a potential strike breaker, but also a father struggling to feed children. Or the sex worker you see that she has dependents in the village, and is sending money, feeding the dependents, etc. Worried about life in the village, including life of family members, sons, etc. Right? Or then there is a figure called a person from the mafia, a gang member in Bombay slums of African origin, who is despised by many people in different parts of the world, because this gang member has been to Hong Kong and Singapore, etc., and eventually comes in Bombay. And there, the gang member, of course, falls in love with this woman who comes to him for help, and recognizes that he is a person who can. People are deriding him. She goes and asks for help, etc., recognizing that he is a human. The sex worker, the prostitute, is also an oft invoked figure. And the sex worker, of course, is a metaphor for the control of body, for the commoditization of people in Bombay. And commodity, because it's a commodity, then there is also a fetish attached to the commodity. So the feelings of attraction, lust, fear, loathing are also projected on the sex worker. Right? And it's this sex worker through this poem on Mandakini Patil that Dasal is expressing hope in the ability of outcasts to dream of an alternate world, which will be created through a revolution. This revolution, of course, again, the way it played out in practice is mixed, because Dalit literature gained recognition. And Dalit literature, of course, literature is a field of power. There are big writers, and if you're asking for recognition, who are you asking for recognition, or who do you want to recognize you and your field as a writer, right? That itself sets them in power relationship. There's, of course, awards. There's also, of course, publication, who will publish you. All that, Dalit literature is a field of literature. So the revolution that is proposed by Dalit writers, who some of them started the Dalit Panther movement, of course, the revolution outside literature did not go anywhere, was co-opted by different political formations. including the Congress Party and eventually the Shiv Sena and all others. And it was in this context, but Dalit literature gained awards, right? Gained recognition from some of the readership, from some of the writers, from the state also. And it's in this context of the political defeat of the Dalit Panther movement, of the communist movement in Bombay, that we see then the imposition, the rise of neoliberalism in Bombay in this context in the 1980s, right? Where there is an informalization of the economy and shift from manufacturing to services. Many of the big manufacturing units, including the textile industry, break down, but some of that manufacturing shifts into slums, and therefore you see the continued existence of slums in Bombay city and the growth of slums in Bombay city, right? Many of the service sector workers, many of them, of course, also continue to live in slums, right? And but that dream of the revolution then still keeps getting invoked. You know, many people, even now, for instance, if you see some of the writers who are in jail now, for some of them for being urban Naxals, they invoke the term revolution again and harken back to the Dalit Panther movement, and then also, of course, go back to earlier revolutionary period. So revolution keeps getting invoked again and again. Right? So revolution is an important theme in order to understand the history of Bombay, along with the slums. Let me stop here. I may have gone over time actually, and see if you have any questions or clarifications. I'll be happy to answer those questions. I'll stop share now.
And I think that that's such a powerful part of the argument. I wonder if you could say just a little bit more, because I really like the Rohit Day book. I mean, it's such an optimistic view of the Constitution, right? And you feel after you read Rohit Day's book that nobody loses in this Constitution, right? Because every citizen can sue the government, which is such a novel idea, right? And of course, we know it doesn't quite turn out that way, right?
Absolutely, right. No, absolutely. No,
let me just ask. It sounds like you're hinting that constitutionalist solution kind of evacuates the urgency for revolution. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, it's a very sharp reading actually of the talk, and I'm definitely, I was hinting because I wanted to write that maybe borrowing Rohit Day's language, that social revolution gets institutionalized in the Constitution, but I wanted to use the word, but maybe also entombed in the Constitution, right? And people are then, they look up to the Constitution, of course, mobilize, etc. But very soon they realize that it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Which is why by the 1960s, then you have factions of the Marxists or by Maoists, etc., who are, take the path that they do take. Right? Yeah. So I love Rohit Day's book, and I haven't read all the chapters fully. I've, like most people, have read the introduction a little more closely than some of the other, which I want to read actually, because it's such a well-written book. But also there is a prehistory, right? I mean, what I also wanted to give was a prehistory, that why would the elite just grant some of the institutionalized social revolution, which in his thinking, the law, etc., the constitutionalists, the constitution makers give institutionalized social revolution. But why would they do that unless there is this history, there is this movement behind it?
Yeah.
Right. So there is a prehistory that because of that, because this revolution is such a theme from the early 20th century, that's why something like the constitutionalists, which they're seeing that this is, there are these strong movements of people, Marxist movements, anti-caste movements, and that's why something like they have, I would say, no other option but to do it, institutionalize it in the Constitution. Right.
I mean, that's why Ambedkar's position is so interesting, right? Exactly. And anyway, I thought it was a fascinating idea, but I guess I would, as somebody who's watching from the sidelines, it's your project, right? I mean,
but that's great. No,
striking, right? One of the things that's quite striking is how much of the historical scholarship focuses on these revolutions that just were incomplete, right? And we used to say it was the fault of the peasant or the fault of the, Indian that somehow we'd never materialize into a revolution. But in fact, things were done to prevent that revolution from materializing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
And
a lot of the
think
English historians, for instance, Christopher Hill, all of that, I mean, they are still looking for their revolutions, right? I mean, why doesn't revolution happen in Britain? But I think I mean, that was the thing that, I mean, the thing that's important about the Day book, I think, is that it's minority litigants, right, who have a space in this arrangement, right? Absolutely.
And of course, the Dalit is in some ways the quintessential minority in this newly forming scheme, which I think is really interesting. But thank you so much for that talk. That was really wonderful.
Please.
No, I thought that was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask a quick question, which was just about when you were talking in particular about some of the debates around caste capitalism. Would capitalism undo effects of caste? Would it annihilate caste? Immediately, my mind was sort of turned to some of those debates around that were happening, I assume, in similar times in Marxism around racial capitalism, and whether the category of race similarly would be reproduced by capital or actually eliminated by capital. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether there was much interaction in these conversations across the sort of Marxist universe at the Comintern's and things like that, or how you see the connection between sort of caste capitalism and racial capitalism in your own work.
No, that's a great, one of the books that I enjoy about and was an inspiration was, of course, Robin D.G. Kelley as a scholar, and in his book on the Alabama communists. And now, of course, I've read the book now 10 years ago, so I may I may not be able to say something very clearly on that book. But one of the things that I loved about that book was that in that movement, there were, of course, many African Americans who were part of the communist movement. But in that movement, at that moment, he provides space even for white supremacists in that political movement to align with some of the workers on the question with the African American workers. He makes it that there is a possibility that opens up in that particular moment. Right? And that was, of course, that is something that stayed in my mind, the way that he had posed that problem, and the importance that he places on moments and political movements in order to create a solidarity which can be absolutely ephemeral and short-lived. But in that short-lived space, there is that solidarity, and which you see some of that solidarity and some of those tensions continue into Bombay. Right? During the 1928 strike, of course, Ambedkar and the communists, they come to an agreement. Particularly, they come to an agreement because Ambedkar makes it a point that the question of caste and the question of hiring Dalit workers in higher paying jobs is posed as one of the demands, is one of the demands of the mill workers that they place in front of the capitalists or the mill owners. Right? And that's why Ambedkar ends up supporting the 1928 strike. But he may not have been totally convinced by it, but he ends up supporting it. Right? Of course, it's a different matter that the mill owners then say that this caste is a question that has to be resolved by the workers themselves. They have nothing to do with it. Right? They throw it back on the workers, on the trade unions, that they have to resolve that. But in 28, there is you can see them coming together. But in the 29 strike that happens in Bombay, again, there is no alliance between Ambedkar and the communists, because these long strikes, according to Ambedkar, are very detrimental for some of the poor, for most of the poor Dalit laborers. Right? So the point I'm saying is this racial capitalism, that scholarship is fascinating, and I've learned from that scholarship. I read some of that scholarship too. And you see some of those tensions, you can see some of those connections, not in the same way maybe, but you see that among Bombay Marxists and Bombay Dalits too. And of course, the sustained dialogue about how to think of caste and class together, that sustained dialogue of what a social revolution would mean. A social revolution for Marxists, a social revolution for Dalits, that sustained dialogue never happens, of course. Right? But there are these episodic alliances which creates a movement, and by episodic alliances, I mean maybe on strikes, they would end up supporting each other's strikes in the 1930s and 40s. But this, what would a comprehensive social revolution mean? That question is never quite addressed or discussed in depth by either the Marxist movement or the Dalit movement.
That's great. Thank you so much.
So Junaid, I have a question in the chat that I wanted to read out. It's by Professor Alka Basu. She's saying, fascinating talk. Is it largely based on your book? Then I must get and read the book. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Professor Basu. Thanks. It is largely based on the book, but it's also now trying to go beyond. So some of the, for instance, the talk about Dange and Dange's inspiration that he draws from Tilak. And some of those are some of the new things that I'm hoping to add. The new work is on Marxists, so the new work will be on Bombay Marxists, particularly Gangadhar Adhikari. But yeah, it was deriving a lot from the book.
I also had a question that I wanted to ask you. So I'm not a historian, but I do. But I mean, I have a chapter in my dissertation where I documented the history of a particular city. And I haven't gone down to the level of informal settlements or what I call bostis in Bangladesh. So what I did want to know about the methods of your research and a little bit and how you collected the information and also some of the stories that you mentioned. And I was particularly curious I felt like a lot of the, when you're speaking about translation, I mean, I thought about how I would also document that in Bangladesh and whether I would get people who are literate. So it really brought up a lot of imagination from my part. And I would love to hear about your process a little bit.
Thank you for asking that question, actually. And that process, of course, is important. I came to the topic, to this work from my interest really in labor history. Right? I used to be a journalist, as you mentioned, and I used to be a journalist in Bombay. And around 2000, 2001, that's when I was covering on the city beat of a newspaper. It's a small newspaper called Asian Age, and you had to cover a lot of things. In that, some of the things that I had to cover was some of the transformations that were happening in the labor area. So I had to write some stories on labor. And I had no understanding of either history or labor history, anything of the city, right? So really, that's when my interest in labor history got sparked, so to speak, and that I wanted to read a little bit on labor. Simultaneously, also, of course, I was reading some things by writers and reading literature in Marathi by Dalit writers. So when you're a historian, that the chronology takes care of itself. When you're interested in labor history, you start from the 19th century, and then if you're interested in literature from the 1960s, 70s, that gives it a nice frame, the chronology. So my entree into this topic was from both sides, as a labor historian, as somebody who was reading Dalit literature, right? Then, of course, then there is the entry point, but then there is a question of archives, right? For the colonial period, there are some lovely archives in Bombay City, Maharashtra State Archives, and then, of course, also the British Library in London. Right? But the archives and that richness of the archives then dries up in the post-colonial period. Right? In the post-colonial period, I mean, you have these housing reports, urban planning reports, which are available in the public domain. But that access to some of the details where you would read some petitions, etc., or debates in the municipal corporation of Bombay, those things I didn't have. Right? So that's where my interest in literature actually ended up. I thought, I should, if I have to say something now and may I have a chapter, then maybe have pose literature as a problematic itself, which will help me then talk about then urban planning, housing, etc., some economic reports, some secondary, some research done by some of the other scholars on informal economy, and then try and combine that with literature. So for the second half, the post-colonial period, I had to had to be a little more creative. And so that's, the process through which, that's the method really, which is read archival sources. And when you're reading archival sources, of course, you read the start with the Home Department files, etc., political. But then you start then getting into some of the other, one of the things I started reading where I saw the Marxist pamphlets was when you read banned literature. And you see that there are all these Marxist pamphlets being clubbed and put under banned literature. So that's where you end up seeing some of the banned literature, some of these material, and then just then it's about reading that material.
We're about 12:15 right now. Are there any other questions? Well, maybe one last question. Sure. Well, please join me in thanking Junaid Shaikh for coming to Cornell from sunny California.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Monday mornings are busy for most people, and thank you for making time.
And we hope to see you all at future SAP events. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Hi.